At 8:47 p.m. on March 12, 1981, a man in a gray overcoat stepped through the revolving doors of the J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. The lobby lighting was the flat, relentless kind you find in federal buildings, humming faintly over terrazzo floors. He carried a worn brown briefcase in his right hand. It was a familiar weight, the same case he took to the Department of Commerce every morning, the same case his youngest daughter had once decorated with a crooked sticker from a science fair. Tonight, the case held copies of documents that would end his marriage, rewrite his children's lives, and enter the quiet machinery of American counterintelligence as just another file number in a basement archive. His name was Richard Coleman. He was 44 years old, an analyst in a mid-level office at the Department of Commerce. On paper, he was the embodiment of stable, unremarkable government service. In the next few hours, he would do exactly what that system expected of him. He would turn in his wife as a Soviet spy. By early 1981, the brief thaw in the Cold War had hardened again. The Carter years were over. Ronald Reagan had taken office a few weeks earlier, talking openly about confronting the evil empire. In the Pentagon, budgets were being rewritten. In Langley and in Lubyanka, analysts quietly adjusted their estimates for escalation. Washington, D.C. was full of visible symbols of that tension. Embassies, motorcades, security details outside buildings whose exact purpose was never explained. Less visible were the offices that seemed purely economic, purely civilian, where no one wore uniforms, and the most dangerous object was a stapler. The Department of Commerce was one of those places. At first glance, commerce looked harmless. It dealt with trade policy, export controls, economic forecasts, timber, steel, grain. The paperwork was dense, technical, boring. But those charts and tables, those dry memoranda, revealed which industries were vulnerable, where the United States depended on foreign sources, how far it could push an embargo before it hurt itself more than its adversary. The Soviet Union's intelligence services understood that perfectly. For years, the KGB's Directorate T and Line X had targeted Western technology and economic information as aggressively as they targeted military secrets. A single mid-level employee with access to forecasts, export licensing data, or internal disputes over trade policy could give Moscow a map of America's weak points. The FBI's counterintelligence division knew it too. By late 1980, a small team inside the bureau was already looking into unexplained overlaps between internal commerce analyses and Soviet economic reporting. The suspicions were still vague. There was no name, no face, just a pattern that suggested someone with access was passing material through the Soviet residentura. When Richard walked into the Hoover Building that March night, he did not know any of that. He knew only what he had found under a loose floorboard in the bedroom closet of his house in Arlington, Virginia. Arlington, in 1981, was the typical Beltway compromise between city and suburb. Brick duplexes, modest two-story homes, lawns that were tidy but not extravagant. Children rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Parents carpooled to federal buildings and agencies whose acronyms were recognizable to anyone who read the Washington Post. Richard and his wife Margaret had bought their house in 1972, when their first child was born, and their future still felt like a straightforward trajectory: career advancement, mortgage payments, school plays, eventually college tuition. The house had 3 bedrooms, a small yard, and a piano in the living room. On paper, Richard's career was unremarkable. He had started at Commerce in the early 70s, working his way up through a series of tedious-sounding positions: junior analyst, senior analyst, specialist in agricultural export trends. His performance reviews called him methodical, reliable, thorough. No one ever called him brilliant. No one needed to. The system depended on men like him who did not seek attention. His security clearance was moderate. He did not attend meetings at the White House, but he did see internal memoranda that never reached the newspapers. early drafts of policy, internal disagreements over export controls, projections that could affect negotiations with allies. Margaret, to the outside eye, was exactly what one might expect the wife of such a man to be. She had worked full-time as an administrative assistant before the children were born. After their first daughter, Jennifer, arrived, she shifted to part-time work, 3 days a week at an office tied to trade policy, part of the same broad world of commerce and economic regulation. The rest of the time, she was at home, doing laundry, cooking, ferrying children to school and music lessons, giving piano classes in the living room to neighborhood kids. Neighbors described her later as friendly but reserved. She organized bake sales, remembered birthdays, and never raised her voice in public. The younger children sometimes fell asleep to the sound of her rehearsing Chopin in the evenings. They had 3 children. Jennifer, who was 13 in 1980, academically driven and already arguing about politics in social studies class. Michael, 11, who disassembled radios and toys just to see how they worked. And Sarah, 8, who stapled her drawings to the walls of her bedroom and slept with the same stuffed rabbit every night. From the street, the Coleman house looked like a small, stable part of the American middle class. The fact that both parents worked for or around the federal government was completely normal in that neighborhood. The fact that one of them had turned that access into a covert channel to Soviet intelligence was invisible. Until the afternoon, Richard came home with the flu. On January 28, 1981, sometime after 2:30 in the afternoon, Richard left work early. He had woken with a sore throat and a low-grade fever, the kind of thing men in his position usually ignored. But that winter, half the office had been passing the same illness around. His supervisor told him to go home before he infected the rest. Arlington was quiet when he pulled into the driveway. The children were at school. Margaret's car was in its usual place. When he opened the front door, she appeared at the top of the stairs, breathing just a little too fast, her cheeks unnaturally flushed. Later, he would replay that image again and again. At the time, he simply explained, "Flu, maybe. Going to lie down." She asked if he needed tea. Her voice was normal, but there was a tension in the way she smoothed her skirt that he only recognized in hindsight. He went to the bedroom, changed, and lay on top of the covers. At some point, he drifted into an uneasy sleep. When he woke, the light had shifted, and there was the familiar noise of Margaret moving around the house. Nothing about that afternoon was dramatic. The real turning point came the next day. On the morning of January 29th, Richard was getting dressed when he noticed that one of the boards inside their bedroom closet sat slightly higher than the others. It had always been a little loose, but now the edge caught the light differently, raised just enough to suggest someone had pulled it up. He knelt, pressed down, then gently pried it up with his fingers. The nails were loose enough to move. Underneath, instead of the expected dust and forgotten buttons, there was a small metal box, about 8 by 6 inches. He hesitated only a second, then lifted it out. Inside, stacked with the neatness of a file clerk, were 23 photographs of documents. Some bore the markings he knew too well: internal distribution codes, classification stamps. A few were memoranda he recognized because he had seen them himself on his desk at Commerce. There were 4 letters written in Russian, but not in any simple, flowing script. The text was broken into groups, with numbers and symbols threaded through. To Richard's eye, this looked like code, structured, deliberate. There was a set of photo processing receipts from a shop in Georgetown, dated at intervals from May 1980 to January 1981. And there was a small, worn 3x5 notebook filled with rows of numbers and letters in a tight, careful hand, the sort of thing he had seen years before in a training video on basic ciphers when he first received his clearance. For several long minutes, he simply sat on the floor, holding the box, with the closet door partly open. He knew, immediately and without any plausible alternative, what it meant. These were not the kind of things a bored housewife collected by accident. Someone in his home was photographing sensitive documents and corresponding with a foreign service. Only 2 adults lived in that house. Many people, confronted with such a discovery, might act on instinct, confront, accuse, demand an explanation. Richard did not. He was a man trained, however minimally, to handle sensitive information. He had spent years in a culture where one did not act without documentation, where everything was logged and verified. He had also spent years with the woman whose box he had just opened. He did not go downstairs and ask her what she was doing. He put the box back exactly as he found it, carefully lowered the board into place, and closed the closet door. Over the next 6 weeks, he became something he had never expected to be, an amateur counterintelligence officer running a private investigation against his own wife. First, he documented. He bought a camera of his own, a Canon AE1, and began photographing every page in the metal box whenever Margaret was out with the children or at work. He made copies of the Russian letters, the cipher notebook, the receipts. He rolled the film and had it developed at a shop in Silver Spring under a false name, paying in cash. He trained himself to leave absolutely no trace. The box always went back under the same board. The board went back at the same angle. Dust and scuff marks stayed undisturbed. Next, he observed, he began keeping a log in a small spiral notebook he hid in the glove compartment of his car. Each entry had a date, time, and a brief description. Box checked. New photos present. Margaret left house alone 1912, returned 2043. Children in bed before she left, and increasingly, park visit Tuesday, divided by Thursday. Margaret's pattern, once he started watching, was regular. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, after dinner, she often said she was going to the store, or to the pharmacy, or to see a friend. She would leave around 7:15 and return somewhere close to 9. Until those weeks, he had not thought twice about it. In a household where both parents worked, errands in the evening were normal. Alone in the car, following at a distance, he saw a different rhythm. He watched as she drove to a nearby park, always parking in roughly the same area. She would walk to a particular bench near the water. She almost never stayed more than 20 minutes. Sometimes she carried a shopping bag, sometimes just her purse. She did not meet anyone obvious. She did not linger. One Thursday, at the end of February, he arrived before she did. He parked where he could see the bench. A man in a conservative overcoat sat down, opened a newspaper, read for a few minutes, then placed the newspaper beside him on the bench before walking away empty-handed. A jogger approaching from the other direction stopped to tie his shoe, picked up the paper as if absent-mindedly, and continued on. 20 minutes later, Margaret arrived and took a seat on the same bench with her purse on the opposite side. To an outsider, it might have looked like nothing. To a man who had sat through security briefings on clandestine communication techniques, it was textbook, a dead-drop service through seemingly unrelated intermediaries. He did not photograph the scene. He simply watched and later wrote it down in his log. The last piece fell into place in the basement. One night in early March, he pretended to fall asleep on the couch. Shortly before midnight, he heard the faint creak of the kitchen floor and the sound of the basement door opening. He waited, counted seconds, then minutes. When the house was quiet again, he went down. Behind a row of paint cans against the far wall, he found a canvas bag. Inside were a second identification card in Margaret's photo, but under another name, a folded map of the Washington metropolitan area with several small circles drawn in blue ink, a few $100s in cash, and a pocket calendar with certain dates marked dates that corresponded almost exactly to the evenings he had logged as park visits. By then, he no longer needed confirmation. This was not a misunderstanding, it was a sustained operation. He made copies, placed everything back, and went upstairs. For several nights, he slept only in fragments. By March 10th, Richard had a photographic record of the contents of the box, the basement bag, and enough entries in his surveillance log to demonstrate a pattern. He also had a problem that no training manual had prepared him to solve. On one side was his legal and moral obligation as a cleared government employee. He had discovered what appeared to be espionage in his own home. If he did nothing, he might be complicit in the continued delivery of sensitive information to a hostile foreign power. On the other side were 3 children who, as far as he could tell, had no idea what their mother was doing. If he turned her in, he would almost certainly destroy their family. Prison, trials, hearings, these were not things one could hide forever. Children in schoolyards learned to spit the word traitor with special emphasis. If he stayed silent, he would live with a different kind of knowledge, that someone in his house was committing an act that, in his world, approached the level of treason. He tried to imagine confronting Margaret, giving her a chance to explain. Every scenario he played out in his head ended in chaos, shouting, denial, possibly her flight, possibly a panicked attempt to destroy evidence that might be crucial to an eventual prosecution. He considered doing nothing. The option lasted in his mind maybe an hour. In the end, the man described in his performance evaluations, methodical, reliable, thorough, took over. First, he assembled the evidence in a way that could speak for him. He labeled the photographs, organized them into envelopes, and wrote a concise summary in his neat, bureaucratic handwriting: dates, locations, observed behavior. Next, he imagined the conversation he would have to have with his children if their mother simply vanished into a system they did not understand. He concluded that they could not be told the truth, at least not immediately. He believed, perhaps arrogantly, that they would not survive it emotionally. So he did what many people in his world were trained to do. He drafted a cover story. He went to the library. He checked out medical texts about cancer. He read pamphlets from oncology clinics. He learned the language of metastasis and treatment protocols well enough to sound plausible. He came up with a hospital several states away, a plausible specialist, a treatment plan that would explain long absences and limited visitation. He decided that, if the FBI agreed, this would be the official explanation. Their mother was very sick. She needed to go away to be treated. They might not be able to see her often. It was a lie designed, in his mind, to protect them. It would also, conveniently, make it easier for the Bureau to operate quietly. On March 12th, he put the envelopes into his briefcase and drove to the J. Edgar Hoover Building. Inside the FBI, the room they gave him was small and functional. A table, 3 chairs, a tape recorder. The man who introduced himself as Special Agent David Thornton was in his 30s, with the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen both overblown suspicions and quiet disasters. He slid a legal pad across the table, placed a folder with bureau letterhead beside it, and turned on the recorder. Richard laid the briefcase on the table, opened it, and began taking out the envelopes. He started with the photographs of the documents, identifying the ones he recognized from his own work. He explained where he had found them, under which board, on what day. He produced copies of the Russian letters and the cipher notebook, apologizing that he could not read Russian, but emphasizing the structure. He handed over the photo processing receipts. He described the pattern of Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the park bench, the overcoat, the jogger, the apparent dead drop. He described the basement bag, the alternate ID, the map with circled locations. He did not raise his voice. He did not dramatize. It was all matter of fact, like presenting a report at Commerce. Thornton asked him to confirm his wife's full name, date of birth, employment history. He asked how long she had worked in or near trade-related offices. He asked about her contacts, hobbies, foreign travel. At some point, someone from another office joined them with a slim folder. There had been, it turned out, an ongoing inquiry into possible leaks from Commerce. There were already suspicions about a small set of offices where Margaret occasionally worked. The material Richard brought in filled gaps they had not been able to close on their own. Once the facts were laid out, Thornton asked him what he expected to happen next. Richard paused, then said 2 things. He said that his wife should be arrested and prosecuted, and he said that his children should never learn, not from the FBI and not in the immediate future, what she had done. He laid out the cancer story in the same flat tone he had used to describe the documents. He proposed that the Bureau allow him to tell the children their mother was seriously ill and would be going away for treatment. He asked that any arrest be carried out in a way that did not expose the children to the spectacle. For a federal agent, it was a strange position to be in. The Bureau did not normally involve itself in family fictions. It built cases, not narratives for children. Still, there were practical advantages. A quiet disappearance for medical reasons would cause fewer ripples than a highly visible arrest. It might keep potential Soviet handlers from understanding how much the FBI knew, how quickly they had moved, or how they had gotten their information. Somewhere above Thornton's level, a decision was made. They would arrest Margaret quickly, minimize publicity, and not interfere with whatever domestic story Richard told his children, so long as it did not obstruct the legal process. The system, in effect, agreed to help maintain a lie as the price of a clean operation. 2 days later, on Saturday, March 14th, just before 7 in the morning, 2 unmarked sedans pulled quietly up to the curb in front of the Coleman house. Inside, the children were still asleep. Margaret was in the kitchen, making coffee. Richard had left the front door unlocked. According to later reports, the entry was calm and by the book. 2 agents knocked once, opened the door, and identified themselves. They stepped into the kitchen, where Margaret put down the coffee pot and listened. She did not scream. She did not deny. When they informed her she was under arrest for espionage-related offenses, she glanced once at Richard, as if confirming something they had never spoken aloud. Whatever passed between them in that moment left no record. She allowed her wrists to be handcuffed. She was led out through the living room, past the piano, into the waiting car. The neighbors, behind their own curtains, saw nothing. Upstairs, Jennifer dreamed of a biology exam. Michael slept with a disassembled radio on his nightstand. Sarah hugged her stuffed rabbit and turned over once, briefly bothered by a sound she could not quite place. By the time they came down for breakfast, their mother was gone. Later that day, Richard gathered them in the living room. Their faces, in the family photographs taken around that time, still had a lingering childhood softness. He told them, gently and with the authority they had always trusted, that their mother had been very sick. Doctors had found something serious. She had been admitted to a special hospital a few hours away. The treatment would be complicated. They would not be able to see her often because of infection, risk, and distance. He had prepared himself with technical terms: chemotherapy, radiation, immune system. He had pamphlets to show them, printed schedules he said the doctors had given him. His story was detailed enough to be convincing. The children cried. They asked questions about when she would come home. He gave answers that were vague but hopeful. That night, he stood alone in the doorway of the bedroom with the loose floorboard and tried to breathe in a house that no longer sounded the same. The legal process that followed moved partly in shadows. Margaret was taken first to a local facility, then transferred under federal authority. She was interviewed by FBI agents and Department of Justice attorneys under conditions shaped by the Classified Information Procedures Act, which allowed the government to protect sensitive material during criminal proceedings. The charges were precise and heavy. She was accused of conspiring to commit espionage, of unlawfully obtaining and transmitting information related to the national defense, and of acting as an agent of a foreign government without notifying the Attorney General. Under questioning, she began to talk. She described, in outline, how she had been approached years earlier by a woman she knew as a fellow musician and casual acquaintance, a piano teacher, with a neat accent and a diplomatic husband. The relationship had been framed, at first, as cultural. Conversations about music, politics, the need for understanding between nations. The requests had started small, publicly available reports, gossip about office politics, the kind of thing people often dismissed as harmless. Over time, the requests shifted. Internal memoranda, drafts, analyses, not yet public. By then, she was receiving money. By then, she had been told what might happen if she tried to stop. Whether she believed, at any point, that she was serving a higher cause, or whether it quickly turned into fear and obligation, remained murky even in the official summaries. The only clear fact was that, for years, she had photographed documents in secret and passed them along through Soviet channels. In August of 1981, after negotiations between her attorneys and the government, she entered a plea that avoided a full public trial but accepted the substance of the accusations. In exchange for cooperation debriefings about her handlers, methods, and contacts, she received a sentence of 25 years. The court sealed significant portions of the record. The newspapers, if they reported anything at all, did so in brief notices that mentioned an unnamed federal employee convicted on espionage-related charges. There were no headlines connecting her case to a suburban house in Arlington. Inside that house, the official story remained cancer. In the months that followed, the Coleman children adapted, as children do, to a new, unstable normal. Richard took over tasks he had never handled before, packing lunches, signing permission slips, buying clothes. He burned dinners, forgot school events, and then gradually learned the rhythms his wife had managed without comment. He kept the piano exactly where it was. He did not move Margaret's framed photographs from the walls. He spoke of her as if she was still in the world, just in another place. To schools and neighbors, he explained that she was undergoing long-term treatment in a specialized facility. He asked teachers to be patient with changes in behavior. He talked, when required, about experimental therapies and the difficulty of visiting. Jennifer threw herself into schoolwork. She joined clubs, ran for student council, and began to construct an identity built on competence and achievement, as if trying to hold the family together by sheer performance. Michael became more inward, spending hours in the basement with wires, tools, and discarded electronics. He preferred things he could understand by taking them apart. Sarah grew quiet. Adults praised her for being mature for her age. That maturity was, in reality, a kind of cautious withdrawal. She learned early not to ask certain questions, not because anyone explicitly forbade them, but because she sensed they hurt her father. Richard, in his own way, doubled down on the lie. With every year that passed, the cancer story had to be updated. He invented complications and remissions, side effects, and experimental drugs. He answered the children's questions with the kind of detail that made it hard to doubt him. At the same time, he maintained another hidden archive. Every month or so, he would receive a letter from Margaret, written from federal prison on the bland stationery approved for inmates. The letters did not mention classified material or operational details. They asked about the children, recounted mundane routines, expressed remorse in vague, guarded terms. He kept those letters in a locked drawer in his home office. He did not show them to the children. He did not tell them that their mother was still alive in a very different kind of institution than the one they imagined. In some ways, he had simply traded one secret box under the floor for another in a desk. Time moved. By 1987, 6 years had passed since that March morning in the kitchen. Jennifer was 19, away at university, studying biology. The language of illness and treatment was no longer mysterious to her. She read about survival rates, remission statistics, the way certain cancers progressed. From that vantage point, the narrative she had been given since age 13 started to wobble. Her mother had been in treatment for 6 years, often too sick for visitors, yet never definitively gone. There had been crises that never quite resolved, dates for possible visits that always slipped away. Richard's explanations began to sound rehearsed. She did what her father had done years earlier. She began to think systematically. On an evening in April, she phoned him from her dormitory. There are versions of the conversation preserved in therapists' notes and in family recollections, but the exact words matter less than the structure. She told him that the story no longer made sense. She said, with the bluntness of someone who has learned to read data, that either her mother was dead and he could not admit it, or something else entirely was being hidden. He sat in his kitchen, holding the receiver, and understood that the scaffolding he had built was no longer holding. In that moment, he had two options: reinforce the lie or dismantle it. He chose, this time, to tell the truth. He told his eldest daughter that her mother was not in a hospital, but in a federal prison. He told her that, years earlier, he had discovered evidence that Margaret was working for the Soviet Union and that he had gone to the FBI. He told her about the box under the floor, the documents, the meetings, the trial, the sentence. On the other end of the line, there was silence long enough for him to think the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, it was to say that she needed time. Then she hung up. In the days that followed, she told her brother and sister. Michael, then 17, reacted with a cold, focused anger. He wanted details, dates, specific actions, the chain of decisions. He confronted his father in person, demanding to know not only what Margaret had done, but why Richard had chosen to lie for so long. Sarah, 14, responded first with tears, then with a kind of stunned withdrawal. For years, she had organized her feelings around a story of illness and bravery. To find that the entire framework had been constructed by her father, that he had colluded with faceless institutions to keep her in the dark, was a second betrayal layered on the first. Therapists later described their condition as complicated grief. They were mourning not just the loss of a parent, but the loss of a narrative about themselves. The lie had been designed, in Richard's mind, to protect them. In practice, it had delayed and complicated their confrontation with the truth, making it harder, not easier, to integrate. In 1988, at the recommendation of a family friend, they began seeing a family therapist. Sessions took place in a small office with soft chairs and neutral artwork. The three children sat together on one side. Richard sat opposite them. Between them sat a woman in her 50s with a notepad who, over months, watched them circle around the same questions. Jennifer asked why he had not trusted them with the truth when they were younger. Michael demanded to know whether he had enjoyed his role as the hero who saved the country and the martyr who sacrificed his family. Sarah asked, quietly, if anything he had told her as a child had been true. Richard struggled to explain something he had never fully articulated, even to himself. He said that, at the time, he had believed children could not survive the knowledge that their mother had betrayed the country that fed and housed them. He said he had believed that their faith in at least one parent needed to remain unbroken. The words did not sound convincing, even to his own ears. In the structure of the story, he remained the man who chose the state's need for secrecy over his children's right to an unvarnished reality. When the therapist asked him whether he would make the same decision again, knowing what he knew now, he hesitated. In that hesitation lay the full weight of his actions. By the mid-1990s, the children were no longer children. Jennifer was an adult with a job in a hospital. Michael was studying engineering. Sarah was in college, trying to decide whether to trust anyone enough to form a long-term relationship. In 1995, they made a decision together. They would visit their mother. The road to the prison ran through anonymous landscapes, highway exits, gas stations, fast food chains. The facility itself was a low-slung complex surrounded by fencing and razor wire, the kind of place that looks, from a distance, interchangeable with warehouses or distribution centers. Inside, the visiting room had bolted down tables and vending machines. Guards moved with the practiced indifference of those who see dozens of reunions and arguments each week. They recognized their mother immediately. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, her posture slightly stooped, but her eyes were the same as in the photographs on the living room wall. She walked toward them with a tentative smile that collapsed into tears halfway across the room. What was said in those hours cannot be fully reconstructed. Different siblings remember different emphases, but certain themes emerge. She told them about the progression of her recruitment, framing it as a slow tightening of a net, how favors had turned into obligations and obligations into threats. She painted a picture of a younger version of herself, bored and restless and flattered by attention, then trapped by consequences she had not foreseen. She expressed remorse, not in grand, sweeping statements about treason and ideology, but in specific regrets about missed birthdays and piano recitals she had imagined from her bunk. She did not try to justify what she had done as right. She tried, instead, to make it comprehensible. For their part, the children asked questions that blurred the line between personal and political. Did you ever think of us when you were copying those documents? At what point did you realize you could go to prison? Why didn't you stop? Underneath all of it ran another question. If you loved us, how could you have crossed this line? And if our father loved us, how could he have decided that we could not be trusted with the truth? When the visit ended and she was led away, they walked back to the car with a sense that their family story had gained new dimensions but no simple resolution. They visited again, sporadically, over the next decade. A strange, prison-mediated version of family life took shape. Birthdays acknowledged in letters, brief physical meetings in supervised spaces, affection compressed into approved gestures. Richard never joined them. In 2006, after serving roughly 22 years of her sentence, Margaret was released on parole. She moved to a small apartment in Atlanta and found work in a music store surrounded by instruments she could no longer teach in the old way. She lived quietly, another middle-aged woman in a southern city where few knew or cared what she had done in another life. Her children visited when they could. The relationships remained complicated. Some wounds scarred over, others remained raw. The past did not vanish. It sat between them at kitchen tables and in phone calls, shaping what they could and could not say. Back in Arlington, Richard grew older. He retired from commerce. He tended his garden. He watched neighbors move in and out of houses on the block. To those who knew nothing of his past decisions, he was simply a widower whose wife had died years ago. The language he had eventually adopted when the cancer story became too cumbersome to maintain. In 2010, at 73, he died of a heart attack while pruning shrubs in his yard. Neighbors found him. The children returned for the funeral. In the days after the burial, they sorted through his belongings. Clothes went into bags for donation. Old bills and tax forms were shredded. Photographs were divided, some kept, some discarded. In the small room he had used as an office, they found the locked drawer. The key was in a ceramic dish on the same desk. Inside were bundles of letters, bound with rubber bands gone brittle with age. The return addresses were from federal institutions. The handwriting was their mother's. There were more than 200 letters written over 2 decades. They covered everything from mundane prison routines to carefully worded reflections on guilt and love. Some contained clumsy attempts at parenting through the mail, addressed to children who had never read them at the time. In that drawer, the structure of their family's silence was laid out in paper form. He had not burned them, he had not shared them. He had carried them for years as a private archive of the life he had chosen to manage from a distance. Standing in that office, with the letters spread out on the desk, the 3 siblings were confronted again with the fact that their childhood had been shaped as much by what was withheld as by what was done. In the official records of the FBI and the Department of Justice, the Coleman case is one more entry in a long list of Cold War espionage prosecutions. In that context, it is a modest success. A leak from the Department of Commerce was identified. Valuable economic intelligence flows to the Soviet Union were interrupted. An agent was arrested, debriefed, and sentenced. Methods were documented. For the agencies involved, it was one small victory in a protracted struggle. But those records do not capture what happened in the house in Arlington. They do not show the years in which 3 children organized their understanding of illness, death, and loyalty around a lie their father maintained with the state's tacit cooperation. They do not capture the particular cruelty of a situation in which truth itself became classified. In simple moral narratives, categories are clear. The spy is the villain. The one who turns in the spy is the hero. The children are victims. The reality here is less clean. Margaret's actions were undeniably harmful at the level of national security. She passed sensitive information to a hostile power in exchange for money and under the influence of manipulation and fear. She made choices that placed her family in jeopardy. Richard's actions, from the state's perspective, were correct. He recognized a threat, documented it, and reported it. He cooperated with investigators, he preserved evidence, he likely prevented further damage. From his children's perspective, the calculus is different. For them, the betrayal was double. Their mother had led a double life that ended in prison. Their father had imposed a layer of fiction over that reality and enlisted government institutions, implicitly or explicitly, as co-conspirators in the lie. When they needed something solid to stand on, he gave them a narrative whose foundation was absence. In that sense, the Coleman story exposes something particular about systems built on secrecy. The Cold War required and rewarded people who could compartmentalize ruthlessly. It asked them to put national security in a place beyond question and to subordinate other loyalties when those loyalties conflicted. Richard did exactly that. He chose the country over his wife. Then he chose what he believed was his children's psychological safety over their right to know what had happened in their own home. Margaret chose, at critical moments, something else again: her fear of her handlers, her ideological confusion, her pride, her boredom, her resentment. Whatever combination of motives drove her, the end result was that she turned privileged access into leverage for a foreign service. The children had no choices in the matter. They were simply the terrain over which these competing loyalties fought. Years later, as adults, they would still argue among themselves about who had been more wrong and about whether there had ever been a path that did not involve damage. What remains, at the end, is not a clear lesson, but a set of images. There is the image of a metal box under a loose floorboard, holding photographs of documents and coded letters. There is the image of a woman in handcuffs being led out of a sunlit kitchen past a piano where she once taught neighborhood children. There is the image of 3 teenagers in a therapist's office trying to reassemble their sense of reality from fragments of belated truth. And there is the final image, a desk drawer opened after a funeral, spilling out decades of unsent, unread, or delayed words from a mother to children who had grown up under the shadow of a war they never saw and a system that turned even love into something that had to be managed, redacted, and filed away. In that image, the price of the Cold War is not measured in missiles or budgets, but in the quiet erosion of trust inside a single ordinary house on a quiet American street where the most dangerous thing was never a gun or a bomb, but a decision about who deserved to know the truth.